quite a few members of the elite, and I've talked about this before, would really just like to see an end to this war. And because I think it's pretty clear if we look back on how things have played out. This really has been Putin's war. It was his idea to invade Ukraine in 2022. And remember, he really didn't consult very many members. So this is kind of his personal project. And I do think that if he gave if he allowed some sort of concessions, the kinds of things we've been talking about, I don't think that all the members of his government, I think many members of his government would be okay with that because they want this over.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and how the Kremlin will be reacting to Donald Trump's election victory. And I'm delighted to be joined by the historian and Russia specialist Amy Knight, who worked for 18 years at the US Library of Congress as a Russia-Soviet affairs specialist and was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And the New York Times has described Amy as the West's foremost scholar of the KGB. Amy, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I wonder what you think the reaction in the Kremlin has been to Donald Trump's election victory last week.
Well, it's interesting. It's been quite muted. As you know, President Putin was one of the few world leaders not to call up Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, on the telephone and congratulate him. There were later some rumors that there had been a phone conversation between Putin and Trump, but Dmitry Peskov, Putin's publicity person, press person, denied that. So I think basically that the reaction from the Kremlin has been muted for two reasons. Obviously, if they were really happy that Trump was elected, and in my opinion, they probably are, they can't show it because that would be bad for both Putin and Trump, because they're going to be, first of all, hopefully there'll be some negotiation about the Ukraine conflict. Well, then secondly, I think actually nobody here and also in Russia really knows what to expect from Trump. So I don't think the Kremlin or Putin, feel really certain about how he's going to behave. And let me put it this way. If those of us who live in the United States and follow politics closely, we don't know what to expect, then you can imagine, the Kremlin has the same problem.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. And, there is this sense that Ukraine would have been happier with essentially the continuity Biden administration, so maybe Kamala Harris winning, and Moscow might have been happier with the return of Donald Trump. But just because it's happier doesn't mean it is necessarily happy. And there is still a scenario in which potentially if Vladimir Putin refuses to negotiate about a potential peace settlement or refuses to accept Trump's demands, that Trump may even double down on support for Ukraine.
Yes, this is always a possibility. It's interesting because I looked at the long address that President Putin gave at the Valdai conference. I think it was November 7th. And he was asked about the Ukraine conflict. He didn't discuss Trump, but he talked a lot about what was happening in Ukraine in his sort of Vel terms, because it isn't a war, as we all know. And but it was interesting. I mean, Putin was had some pretty strong words, and this was the day after Trump was elected, right? And he kind of doubled down on pretty much everything. In particular, it reminded me of the sort of the original motivation for Russia in going into Ukraine in February 2022, which was this fear of NATO. they didn't they the Kremlin and Putin really, really, really don't want Ukraine to join NATO or to have a security arrangement with NATO. And this was made clear again when Putin spoke at the Valdai conference. And I think that would be a huge stumbling block for any kind of negotiation.
Do you think, because one of the ideas that has been sort of put out there by people close to Trump in recent days is this idea of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine? Do you think that is a non-starter from Moscow's perspective? Because, to me, the obvious hurdle there is, well, who would be policing this DMZ? And if you had Western or even NATO troops there, that clearly would antagonize Vladimir Putin. So what do you make of that, Amy, as an idea?
I don't think that would go over with the Kremlin. I think it's pretty clear that the Kremlin feels that they have to. I mean, they have about 18% of Ukrainian territory right now. And then we have Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region, although quite not a large area. So I think that that the Kremlin, at the very least, would have to hold on to what they have. Um, but they really aspire to 4 regions in eastern Ukraine. So that's one thing. But anything demilitarized, they want a neutral Ukraine. They want this chunk of Ukrainian territory. They want a neutral Ukraine. Now, my view is that everybody's been talking recently, focusing on the victories that the Russian troops have had in eastern Ukraine. And they're beginning to take back a little bit of Kursk. And they've brought in all these Korean soldiers. So it looks like, Russia has the bargaining, is on top in terms of the bargaining situation. But I think we have to remember that, of course, I feel like kind of a broken record when I say this, that this is wearing on Russia and their ability. First of all, the fact that they had to bring in Korean troops shows that they have a real manpower problem. Now, so do the Ukrainians. But, it's not like Russia can just go on and on and on with all these really significant numbers of fatalities in Russian forces. So I think well, if I were advising Trump, I mean, I would definitely say the longer this can last, the harder it's going to be for Russia, and the more likely they would be to make some sort of concessions. But of course, the flip side is that this is also very hard for Ukraine, and well, we could talk about the possibility that Ukraine would be given permission to use these long-range missiles inside Russia. If that were to happen, that would be a game changer, I think.
Now that's very interesting. Now, just on that, as you've raised it, Amy, do you think there's any chance we could get movement on that even before Donald Trump takes office in January? Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, and President Macron of France were meeting in Paris on Monday, and there are some reports they may try one more time to push President Biden whilst he's still in the White House to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow and Scout missiles to hit targets inside Russia. Do you think we may get any movement in the next couple of months on that?
It's interesting because it hasn't really been discussed too much in the Western press since the election. And I've kind of wondered about that because they've been talking about all the things that President Biden can do really quickly before he leaves office. Clearly, that would be one thing. I have no idea whether I think they made a big mistake in being so hesitant for so long. So even though, they want to get going and do something, the Biden administration before Biden leaves office, I don't really see it require a big change in their attitude. And apparently, clearly it's motivated by Putin's threats of some sort of escalation, possibly with tactical nuclear weapons, if we were to allow our long-range Ukraine to use those missiles. So I'm just not sure. It's anybody's guess.
And so, if you think that Putin will have to make some kind of concession if he wants a kind of settlement sooner rather than later because of fear of it dragging on and maybe him having to launch a fresh wave of mobilization with all the political problems that entails, what might a Russian concession look like? I mean, Ukraine might need, if it's going to cede some territory, it might need a guarantee around its security, for example, NATO membership. But how would Moscow view that? And can you see any scenario in which Putin would agree to that as part of a settlement?
I really, really, really can't. I think that Putin is far more likely to be willing to make some concessions on the amount of territory that Russia would end up with than he is to make the concession of allowing Ukraine into NATO. Because, as I say, that really was kind of um, the motivation initially. Is Russia's fear of NATO, and that they and how realistic it is a total is another question. But they just really don't want their largest neighbor, Ukraine, to be a member of a NATO state, because then they could bring troops in. So for Russia, I think that's unacceptable. Um, and this makes it very hard. I mean, it's interesting for both Trump, President-elect Trump, and Putin, because Trump, I don't think he's promised on day one that he's going to reach a peace agreement, but I really don't think he can afford to just sort of give away Ukraine. Even if he could force Zelensky into an agreement that would be very disadvantageous for Ukraine. But he could, the scenario is he'd say, you don't get anything more from us if you don't do this. But I just am not sure that would be a win situation for Mr. Trump. But then we have the alternative for President Putin just at this point, which is if he were to make concessions at all. I mean, remember, in February 2022, Russian troops aimed to occupy all of Ukraine. They've lost, estimates say, 600,000 Russian soldiers. So it's not going to look very good for Putin to say, okay, we've changed all of our goals and we're going to do this. So really, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. And my feeling will be that there won't be any kind of agreement. I think it's going to drag on. And I think people are going to wait and see how the chips fall, what happens with, as you say, possibility, all sorts of other things. But I would not anticipate that on, day one of Trump's administration that he's going to sit down with Putin and Zelensky.
Hello, it's James here. We'll be right back with Frontline in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about our brand new YouTube channel called Times Radio History. And if you like Frontline, I have a feeling you're going to love this. Every week, we explore a different battle or moment in history and replay it, asking ourselves what the long-term consequences might have been had things played out differently. Already, we've done episodes on D-Day, on the Battle of Gettysburg, on Stalingrad, on the First Battle of Ypres in World War I, and our latest episode is all about the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, one of the key moments of the American Revolutionary War. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. It's called Times Radio History. We'll put a link in the description below. Please do check it out.
And talk to me, if you can, Amy, about some of the internal pressures that will be on Vladimir Putin at the moment when it comes to any potential negotiations. I mean, everyone's aware of the political problems when it comes to potentially a future mobilization, or indeed why it's unpalatable for him to have Ukraine in NATO. I think when you were last on Frontline, you used the term, there's a choir of discontent around Putin in the Kremlin. Would they be chiming up if he was seen to cede anything too valuable to Ukraine?
Well, when you say they, we're talking about, it's not like the elite is one, consensual group. I think the military, obviously, they don't want to come out of this whole thing looking like losers. But I think quite a few members of the elite, and I've talked about this before, would really just like to see an end to this war. And because I think it's pretty clear if we look back on how things have played out. This really has been Putin's war. It was his idea to invade Ukraine in 2022. And remember, he really didn't consult very many members. So this is kind of his personal project. And I do think that if he gave if he allowed some sort of concessions, the kinds of things we've been talking about, I don't think that all the members of his government, I think many members of his government would be okay with that because they want this over. I think the problem might be the military, but even they could be talked into something. I think it's really more going to be Putin's decision and his perception of how it's going to go down with the public if he does back down on all these claims. But he certainly, as of last week, didn't look like he was prepared to do that.
Do you think, Amy, there's also a risk for Vladimir Putin in the sense that he's tried very hard in recent years to cultivate a better relationship with Beijing and also with Tehran, and we have now Iranian Shahed drones being used on the front lines in Ukraine, and that, maybe, is the thing most likely to antagonize Donald Trump, this sense that Russia is building closer alliances with China and Iran. Is there a real risk there for Putin?
A real risk of antagonizing Trump or a real risk of the relations?
Yes, a risk of antagonizing Trump through his relationship.
Well, Trump, as we all know, is a very transactional person, and he doesn't really believe in loyalties. Or of course, people have to be personally loyal to him, but he's, a quintessential opportunist. And I think I don't think Trump is looking at Putin in terms of someone that he could trust and that he wouldn't like it if Russia started to align more closely with China. I think it will all be sort of like out on the table what goes on, if I'm being clear about that. Obviously, no one in the U.S. government wants to see further tightening of alignments between China, Iran, and Russia. But there are other ways of handling this that don't necessarily focus right on Ukraine, as you know.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
Well, on that as well, and on Russia's burgeoning alliances with other countries, we probably should just mention a bit about North Korean troops now fighting on the side of Russia. How much significance would you place on that, Amy?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, it's a sign of that the Russian army is in a bit of trouble, right? If they have to bring all these Korean troops in. And of course, there's going to be a quid pro quo with North Korea that they have to, pony up with, and so on and so forth. It seems from everything I've read, these poor North Korean soldiers will be used just basically as cannon fodder. But I still think that it's a pretty bold step in the sense that by bringing in an outside country to have its troops in Russia and fighting against Ukraine, it's kind of a step of a little, maybe going over a red line. And that actually might incentivize the Biden administration and NATO allies to sort of step forward a little more and be a little more bold in their support of Ukraine. So I think I don't think it's going to help Russia that much, because from everything I've read, these troops are not very well trained, and there are going to be all sorts of logistic problems. And if anything, it's just basically going to give NATO allies further reason to maybe overstep some lines that they weren't going to consider before.
Amy Knight, we always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.